She met me at the airport with a little girl in her arms, and before I could even drop my bag, before I could even say her name, the way I'd practiced saying it for 2 years, she looked at me with eyes that were trying so hard not to break. And she said, "I married someone else, but she's yours." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer than a second. I had spent 23 months overseas. 23 months of dust and heat and silence, and letters that stopped coming somewhere around month 14. And I had built an entire homecoming in my head, the kind you build when you have nothing else to hold on to at 3 in the morning on a cot that isn't well. To yours, in a country that isn't yours, doing a job that asks everything of you and gives back almost nothing except the hope that someone is waiting. I had imagined her running to me. I had imagined the smell of her hair, vanilla and something like rain. I had imagined picking her up off the ground the way I used to, spinning her once just to hear her laugh. Instead, I got off that plane in my dress uniform with my duffel bag over one shoulder, and I saw her standing near the baggage claim sign, thinner than I remembered, holding a little girl on her hip who looked maybe a year and a half old, with dark curly hair and eyes that, even from 30 feet away, looked exactly like mine. And before I could process any of it, before my brain could even catch up to what my eyes were telling me, Claire said those words. And the airport kept moving around us like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. People walked past pulling suitcases. A child somewhere was crying about a balloon, and I stood there in my uniform, 23 months of longing collapsing into a single moment I never saw coming. If you've ever come home expecting one life and walked straight into another one, you already know there's no manual for what happens next. But let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need to understand who Claire was to me before you can understand why what she said broke something in me and rebuilt something else entirely. My name is Wyatt Hale. I grew up in a town in Ohio so small that the welcome sign and the goodbye sign were practically back to back. I joined the Army at 19 because I didn't know what else to do with the kind of restlessness that lives in boys who grow up watching their fathers work the same job for 30 years and call it a life. I met Claire when I was 23, home on leave, standing in line at a diner because I didn't know how to cook anything that wasn't microwaved. She was the one who took my order, and she had flour on her sleeve from helping in the kitchen. And when I asked for the biggest plate they had, she laughed and said, "Big appetite or big personality?" I said both, and she wrote something on the ticket that wasn't my order. And when the food came out, there was a smiley face drawn on the inside of the to-go box in ketchup. On our third date, when I'd finally worked up the nerve to ask her to do something other than eat at the diner where she worked, I took her to the county fair on the edge of town, the kind with a Ferris wheel that creaked more than it should have, and a corn dog stand that ran out of mustard by 8 o'clock every single night. She beat me 3 times in a row at the ring toss, and refused to let me win even once, even when I pretended my aim was just naturally terrible. At the top of the Ferris wheel, with the whole town lit up small and golden beneath us, she turned to me and said, completely out of nowhere, "I'm not going to fall for someone who leaves." And I told her I wasn't planning on leaving anything that mattered. And she just looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding whether or no, not to believe me. I went back to that diner every single day of my leave. By the end of 2 weeks, I had her number, her favorite flower, which was anything that wasn't a rose because she said roses were unoriginal, and a promise that I would write to her when I went back. I did write. Every week, sometimes twice a week, even when there was nothing to say except that I missed her, even when the only thing happening that day was sand and waiting. She wrote back just as much. Her letters smelled like her perfume because she'd spray a little on the envelope, and I kept every single one of them in a metal box that used to hold ammunition and now held the only soft thing I had left. We got married 18 months later, in her parents' backyard, under string lights her father hung himself, with 40 people and a cake her mother made, because Claire said anything fancier would feel like a lie. Her mother cried through the entire ceremony, the loud, unembarrassed kind of crying that makes everyone else cry too, And my own mother kept dabbing her eyes with a paper napkin because nobody thought to bring tissues. Claire's father walked her down a path made of mismatched lawn chairs turned sideways, and when he handed her over to me, he gripped my shoulder hard enough to leave a mark and said only, "Bring her joy, or bring her nothing," which I have thought about more times overseas than I can count. I remember standing at that makeshift altar, hands shaking, watching her walk toward me, in a dress that wasn't expensive, but looked like it was made just for her. And I remember thinking that no training, no mission, nothing the army had ever asked of me, had prepared me for how much it would scare me to love someone this much. We had 4 months together as a married couple before my next deployment came through. 4 months of learning how she liked her coffee, which was somehow both too sweet and too bitter depending on the day. 4 months of falling asleep with her feet tucked under my legs because she said my body ran warm like a furnace. 4 months that felt like they were over before they even started. The night before I left, we didn't sleep. We just lay there in the dark, and she traced the scar on my forearm from a training accident years before, and she said, "Promise me you'll come back the same person." I told her I'd come back better. She didn't laugh at that the way I expected her to. She just got quiet, and in that quiet I felt something I couldn't name yet, something that felt like fear dressed up as love. I left the next morning, before the sun was even fully up, and she stood in the driveway in one of my old t-shirts, arms wrapped around herself, and she didn't wave. She just watched until the car turned the corner, and I watched her in the side mirror until I couldn't see her anymore. The first 6 months overseas were almost normal, if anything about deployment can be called normal. My days fell into a rhythm that civilians never quite understand, the kind where boredom and danger sit so close together they start to blur. Up before sunrise, gear checks, briefings that repeated themselves until the words stopped meaning anything. Hours of waiting, broken up by minutes that mattered more than anything else in the world. I bunked across from a guy named Reyes, a quiet kid from Arizona who kept a photo of his motorcycle taped inside his locker because he said, looking at it, reminded him there was a life waiting for him that didn't involve any of this. At night, when the generators hummed loud enough to drown out conversation, I would lie on my cot and read Claire's letters by flashlight until I knew the curve of her handwriting better than I knew my own. The heat during the day was the kind that made the air feel solid, and the dust got into everything. Your boots, your food, the seams of your uniform, until you stopped noticing it, the way you stopped noticing your own heartbeat. We emailed when we could. We video called twice, both times with terrible connection that made her look like she was underwater. But I didn't care, because hearing her voice say my name out loud, instead of just reading it on a page, did something to my chest that I still don't have words for. Then communication got harder. We moved to a more remote post, the kind where signal comes and goes like a rumor, and I started writing letters again, because at least letters eventually arrive, even if they take 3 weeks. And then she told me something in one of those letters that changed the shape of everything, even though I didn't fully understand it at the time. She wrote, "I have something to tell you, and I want to tell you in person, but I can't wait that long, so I'm telling you here instead. I'm pregnant." I read that line standing outside our barracks at 2 in the afternoon, with sand in my boots and sweat soaking through my uniform, and I laughed out loud, alone, like a crazy person, because there was nobody there to share it with except the wind. When Reyes found me still standing there, grinning like an idiot, I showed him the letter, and he read it twice before slapping me on the back hard enough to nearly knock the wind out of me. "Hale's gonna be a dad," he announced to half the barracks. And for the rest of that night, guys I barely talked to were coming up to shake my hand like I'd done something heroic just by getting a letter in the mail. It was the first time in months the whole unit felt less like soldiers and more like a bunch of guys who still remembered what it felt like to hope for something good. I wrote back the longest letter I had ever written in my life. I told her every name I could think of. I told her I didn't care if it was a boy or a girl, as long as they had her stubbornness and my patience. I told her I was going to be the kind of father who showed up to every single thing, every recital, every game, every disappointment, and every victory that country could touch. And then, everything went quiet. Our unit got moved again, deeper into a region where we were told communication would be limited for operational reasons, possibly for months. I want you to understand what that phrase means when you're the one living it. It means you write letters you don't know if anyone will ever read. It means you fall asleep wondering if the woman carrying your child knows you're still breathing. It means the silence isn't empty, it's heavy. It sits on your chest at night, like something with weight and a heartbeat of its own. Back home, Claire was living a different kind of silence. She didn't know about the operational blackout. All she knew was that my letters stopped. 2 weeks of nothing. Then 4. She told me later that she started reading my old letters out loud to her stomach because she said if I couldn't talk to our baby, she wanted our baby to at least hear what my voice sounded like on paper. And then one afternoon in October, a car she didn't recognize pulled into her parents' driveway, and 2 men in uniform stepped out, and Claire said she knew, the second she saw them through the window, she knew, because nobody sends 2 men in uniform to your door to deliver good news. I won't make you wait the way she had to wait, because this is the part of the story that still makes my throat tight every time I think about it. The visit wasn't what she feared. It wasn't a death notification. It was something almost crueler in its uncertainty. There had been an incident involving my unit. A communication error in the chain of casualty reporting had listed several names, including mine, under a status that wasn't confirmed dead, but wasn't confirmed alive either. Missing, pending verification. The kind of bureaucratic phrase that sounds careful on paper and feels like a knife in real life. Claire said she stood in that doorway, 8 months pregnant, holding onto the frame so her knees wouldn't give out, and asked the officer the only question that mattered. The officer's name tag said Castillo, and Claire told me years later that she remembers it specifically because she kept staring at it instead of his face, like focusing on 5 letters could somehow keep her standing upright. Behind her, through the screen door, the kitchen radio was still playing some afternoon talk show. Words about traffic and weather drifting out into a moment that had nothing ordinary left in it at all. Is he alive? And the officer, to his credit, didn't lie to her. He said, "Ma'am, I don't know. I wish I could tell you something different." If you've ever loved someone and lived inside a sentence like, "I don't know," you understand that it is somehow worse than any answer, because it gives you nothing to grieve and nothing to hope for, just an open door that never closes. For 6 weeks, Claire lived inside that open door. She called the base. She called anyone who would answer a phone. She wrote letters that she had no idea where to send, because nobody could confirm where my unit even was. She told me later that during those 6 weeks, she stopped sleeping in our bed because it felt too big, and started sleeping on the couch with the television on low, just so the silence wouldn't swallow her whole. 3 weeks before her due date, with no word from the army, no letter from me, nothing but that unbearable open door, Lily was born. Claire named her after my grandmother, a woman she'd only met twice before she passed, because she said if there was a chance I wasn't coming back, she wanted our daughter to carry a piece of my family with her, something that would connect her to a father she might never get to hold. I need you to know what was actually happening to me during this time, because the not knowing on her end is only half of this story. There had been an ambush. I won't go into the details that don't belong in a story like this one, but I'll tell you that 2 men in my unit didn't come home, and I came very close to being a third. I was injured, not severely, but enough that I was pulled back to a secondary medical post for treatment and recovery, and that post had even less connectivity than the one before it. For almost 2 months, I existed in a kind of limbo myself, healing, debriefing, waiting for clearance to get word out, while back home the Army's own administrative error had already told my wife I might be dead. Nobody told me that mistake had been made. I had no idea Claire was sitting in our living room every night wondering if she was already a widow. The first time I was able to call home, the line connected for exactly 40 seconds before it dropped, and all I managed to say was, "Claire, I'm okay, I'm alive, I'll explain everything," before the call cut out completely. I didn't know if she heard any of it. I tried for 3 more days to get a connection, and failed every time. And then I got pulled into a different assignment for additional recovery time, at a base even further from any reliable signal, and another 6 weeks passed before I could try again. If you are keeping track of the timeline the way I eventually had to, piece by piece, after I came home, you will understand exactly why this story doesn't end the way either of us expected. Claire spent almost 4 months believing I might be dead, raising a newborn alone, sleeping on a couch with the television on, calling offices that gave her nothing but careful, hedging non-answers. And somewhere in that fog, a man named Daniel started showing up. Daniel had been a friend of both of ours for years. He'd grown up 2 streets over from Claire's parents. The kind of family friend who shows up to every graduation and every funeral without needing to be asked twice. He worked construction, divorced young, with no kids of his own, and had always had a quiet, steady way about him that made him easy to forget was even in the room until you needed him. I used to tease him in high school for being too careful with everything, too slow to take a chance on anything. And it turns out that same careful, steady nature was exactly what carried Claire through the worst 4 months of her life. Someone who used to come to barbecues at her parents' house. Someone who, when he heard what was happening, started driving over twice a week to fix things around the house, mow the lawn, sit with her so she wasn't alone with a crying infant and an unanswered question every single night. I want to be honest with you here, because this story doesn't work if I'm not honest. When I first found out about Daniel, every protective, jealous, wounded part of me wanted to hate him. But hate is easy when you don't know the whole truth, and the whole truth is much harder to carry than anger ever was. Daniel never tried to replace me. In the beginning, he was just a friend, showing up the way friends are supposed to show up when somebody is drowning. He held Lily so Claire could shower for the first time in days. He sat with her in the hospital when Lily had a fever spike at 3 months old, because Claire's parents were out of state and she had nobody else to call at 2 in the morning. Slowly, without either of them naming it, something shifted. Not love, not at first, but dependency. The kind that can quietly disguise itself as something else if it goes on long enough. Claire told me later that the lowest point came on a night in February, almost 5 months after the visit from those 2 officers, when she still had received no official confirmation either way, when the Army's own paperwork was still tangled in red tape and conflicting reports, when she sat on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, with Lily finally asleep in the next room, and she said out loud to an empty house, "I don't know how to keep doing this alone." Daniel was the one who answered his phone at 2 in the morning. Daniel was the one who drove over and sat outside her bathroom door, not even coming in, just talking to her through the wood until the sun came up. A few weeks later, with still no confirmation from the Army about my status, with grief and exhaustion and the unbearable weight of raising a child inside a question mark that never resolved, Daniel told her that he loved her, that he had loved her for longer than either of them had probably admitted to themselves, and that he wanted to take care of her and Lily, no matter what happened with me, no matter if I came home or didn't. He told her he didn't need her to love him the way she loved me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He just couldn't watch her drown alone for one more single night. Claire said yes to him in April, almost 6 months after that first knock on the door, in a small courthouse ceremony with nobody but her parents present, because by then, every official channel she'd contacted had either gone silent or told her there was simply no confirmed information available. She believed, with the kind of belief that comes only from total exhaustion, that she had genuinely lost me, and that the kindest thing she could do for our daughter was to give her a stable home with someone who showed up every single day instead of clinging to a silence that might never end. I finally regained full communication 3 weeks after that courthouse wedding. 3 weeks. If you want to know what kind of cruelty timing can have, sit with that number for a second the way I had to. My first clear call home went to her parents' house, because I didn't have a current number for wherever Claire was living. Her mother answered, and there was a long pause on the line. The kind of pause that tells you something before any words do, And then she said, very quietly, "Wyatt, you need to come home. There's a lot we have to tell you." Nobody told me everything over the phone. I think Claire's mother understood that some truths are too big to deliver across thousands of miles of static. So I came home not knowing the full shape of what I was walking into, only knowing that something had happened, something involving Claire, something involving the word married, which her mother had let slip before catching herself. I spent the entire flight home rehearsing different versions of a conversation I didn't have enough information to actually prepare for. I imagined arguments. I imagined her crying and explaining. I imagined 100 different doors, and not one of them was the door that actually opened. The one where I stepped off a plane in my dress uniform and saw my wife standing there with another man's last name and my daughter on her hip. A daughter I had never seen, never held, never even known clearly existed until that letter 8 months earlier that I'd read alone in the sand. So now you understand the airport. Now you understand why those 4 words, "I married someone else," landed the way they did. And why the 5 words right after them, "but she's yours," somehow hurt and healed me in the same breath. I stood there with my duffel bag still on my shoulder, staring at the little girl in Claire's arms. And she stared right back at me with those eyes, my eyes, set into a face that was unmistakably half hers and half mine. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. The airport noise kept happening around us, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the muffled apology of a stranger bumping into my bag. But inside the small space between Claire and me, everything had gone completely silent. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just stood there. Finally, Claire's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I thought you were dead, Wyatt. They told me they didn't know. And then nothing, for months, nothing, and I had a baby alone, and I was drowning, and Daniel was just there. He was just there every single day when nobody else was. And I am not going to apologize for surviving the only way I knew how." I wanted to be angry. God, some part of me wanted so badly to be angry. Because anger felt easier to hold than the grief sitting underneath it. Thinner, older around the eyes in a way 2 years should not have been able to do to a 26-year-old woman. I understood that I wasn't the only one who had been fighting a war. Hers had just been invisible, fought in a living room with a phone that never rang with the right answer. I asked her the only question that mattered in that moment, the one I'd been afraid to ask since the word daughter first left her mouth. "Can I hold her?" Claire's eyes filled, and she nodded, and she stepped closer. And she placed Lily into my arms for the very first time in either of our lives. Unafraid expression, the way babies do when they haven't yet learned to be careful with strangers. And she reached up and grabbed a fistful of the fabric near my collar, the same way I remember my own father telling me I used to grab his collar when I was that age. Something broke open in my chest, right there in the middle of that airport. Something I hadn't let myself feel through 23 months of discipline and distance and dust. I held my daughter for the first time, and I cried. Openly, in my dress uniform, in front of strangers, in front of Claire, in front of a version of my life I never could have planned for. Lily smelled like baby powder, and something faintly like Claire's shampoo, and her tiny fingers were impossibly soft against the rough fabric of my uniform, and somewhere in the part of my brain that was still a soldier, I noted that my hands that had carried weapons and pulled wounded men to safety, had never once shaken until that exact moment. An older woman walking past paused just long enough to whisper, like she somehow understood everything that was happening, without needing a single word of explanation. If you've ever held something you almost lost before you even knew you had it, you understand exactly what that moment felt like. We didn't resolve anything that day. Grief and joy were too tangled together for either of us to make sense of it in an airport parking lot. Claire drove me to her parents' house because, as she put it quietly in the car, "I don't know where home is for you right now, and I didn't want to make that decision for you." And I learned later that he had quietly taken himself out of the house the moment Claire told him I was confirmed alive and coming home, not out of cowardice, but out of a strange, painful decency that I didn't expect and didn't know how to feel about. Over the following weeks, the four of us, Claire, Daniel, Lily, and me, existed inside a situation none of us had a name for. My own parents drove up from Ohio the second weekend I was back, and my mother held Lily for almost an hour without saying a single word, just rocking her slowly on the porch swing, with tears running steadily down her face. My father, a man who has hugged me maybe 4 times in my entire life, pulled me aside afterward and said, "I don't know how you're going to figure this out, son, but you will," which from him counted as a speech. One night, Claire invited me to stay for dinner at the house she still shared with Daniel, and the 3 of us sat around a table, passing dishes, in a silence that wasn't angry, just unfamiliar, all of us learning the shape of a situation none of us had asked for. I stayed at her parents' house. Claire stayed at the house she shared with Daniel, the one I'd never seen, with a crib in the corner that I had no part in choosing. Every few days I would visit, and I would hold Lily, and Daniel would quietly leave the room to give us privacy, never once raising his voice, never once making me feel like an intruder in the life he had built to fill the space everyone believed I'd left empty. One evening, almost a month after I came home, Daniel asked if we could talk, just the 2 of us, on the back porch, while Claire put Lily down for the night. I expected tension. I expected defensiveness. Instead, Daniel handed me a beer, sat down across from me, and said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't love them both, because I do. But I never stopped knowing whose family this really was. I stepped in because somebody had to, and nobody else was standing there. But I'm not going to stand in your way now that you're home, Wyatt. That's not the kind of man I want to be." I didn't know what to say to that. Some part of me wanted to hate him still, just to make things simpler, but simple wasn't available to me anymore. Not after everything I'd learned about the 4 months he'd spent showing up when I physically couldn't. The annulment process took longer than any of us expected, tangled in its own kind of military and legal red tape, made messier by the fact that Claire had genuinely believed, with documentation from the Army's own confused reporting, that I was likely dead at the time she remarried. There were caseworkers, there were lawyers. There were nights Claire and I sat across from each other at her parents' kitchen table, going through paperwork, instead of falling asleep, tangled together the way we used to. But somewhere in all that paperwork, we found our way back to talking, really talking, not about blame, but about the 4 months that had nearly destroyed us both in completely different ways. She told me about the bathroom floor. I told her about the medical post with no signal, about writing letters in my head that I had no way to send. We grieved the time we'd lost together instead of grieving it apart, and slowly, carefully, something that had been broken into pieces began to fit back together, not the same shape as before, but maybe a stronger one, the kind that knows exactly how easily it can shatter and chooses to hold on anyway. Daniel moved out of state about 8 months later, to be near his sister, he said, though I think part of it was simply giving us the space to become a family without his presence as a daily reminder of everything that had happened. He still sends Lily a birthday card every year, and Claire makes sure she knows his name, knows what he did for her in the 4 months I couldn't be there. Because Claire said our daughter deserves to know that love showed up for her in more than one shape, even before she could understand any of it. Claire and I remarried last spring, quietly, in her parents' backyard again, under the same string lights her father had kept all this time in a box in the garage, just in case. Lily was old enough by then to be the world's most chaotic flower girl, throwing petals at guests instead of down the aisle, laughing the whole time in a way that made the entire backyard laugh with her. Standing there again, in the same spot where I'd first promised to come back better, I understood something I hadn't understood the first time. Coming back better doesn't mean coming back unchanged. It means coming back willing to hold the pieces of someone you love, even when those pieces don't to a T fit the picture you carried overseas in your head for 23 months. That night, after the guests left and Lily was finally, exhaustedly asleep, Claire and I sat on the back porch the way Daniel and I once had. except this time it was just us. Her feet tucked under my legs, the way they used to be, before any of this happened, before letters stopped arriving, before 2 officers ever knocked on a door. She rested her head against my shoulder and said, very quietly, I used to think the worst day of my life was the day those 2 men showed up at the door. I asked her what she thought now. She was quiet for a long moment. The kind of silence I'd learned meant she was choosing her words carefully, the way she always did when something mattered. Now, I think it was the day that taught me how strong I actually am, she said. And the day you held Lily in that airport was the day I finally believed we'd survive it. I didn't say anything back. I just held her a little tighter, and somewhere inside that quiet, unremarkable porch, in a town most people will never hear of, I understood that some homecomings don't look anything like the ones you imagine on a cot at 3 a.m, half a world away. I think about Reyes sometimes, who made it home 2 months after I did, and sent Lily a stuffed motorcycle toy for her first birthday, with a note, and just said, tell her Uncle Reyes says hi. I think about Officer Castillo's name tag, and how 5 letters on a stranger's chest became the hinge that an entire family's future swung on. I think about the version of this story where the mistake never happened, where the letters never stopped, where I never feel the particular ache of having missed 8 months of my daughter's first year. But I don't get to live in that version. And somewhere along the way, I stopped wishing I could. Sometimes they look like heartbreak first. Sometimes they look like a stranger's last name and a child you've never met. But if you're patient enough, if you're willing to listen instead of just react, sometimes the homecoming you actually get turns out to be stronger than the one you spent 2 years dreaming about in the dark.